I graduated from seminary, as Nikki says, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. Systems theory was a very big thing in the church. We were all trying to figure out how to solve the problems of our congregations because we knew that they were systems and that people were simply playing out the parts in a system that had existed long before they were there and would exist long after they were gone, until somehow we convinced ourselves what these dysfunctional systems were and looked beyond them. We would just be caught in that cycle over and over again. Well, I learned so much about systems theory that the diocese asked me to do some consulting work with congregations that were struggling. And one of the things I used to do whenever I did that consulting work is I would ask the churches, tell me your story of origin. And they would tell me their story of origin. And I say, pay attention to this. This doesn't go away. This sticks with you your whole life as a congregation. So you need to understand how that story of origin impacts you over time and how it might impact you in the future, and find ways to seek and make better choices than just the choices of your story of origin. Well, I said that to a church one Saturday afternoon when I was doing consulting work with them. And then the next Sunday, as I was sitting in the pews, I was preaching on the gospel that day, but the lesson for the epistle was from 1 Corinthians. And of course, it was about all the problems that the Corinthians were having. They had lots of problems. They were over-obsessed with personal salvation. They were constantly in conflict, and they never seemed to make any impact on the world around them at all. And as I'm hearing that lesson read, I go, oh my gosh, that's one of our stories of origin just for being in the Christian church. Yeah, sure, we have other stories of origin, the Philippians, the Thessalonians, but Corinthians is a big piece of our New Testament, and it's telling our story of origin. A church obsessed with personal salvation, constantly in conflict, terribly ineffective in relating to the world. We don't know any churches like that, do we? No, we don't, not at all. We don't know any. No, we have carried that story with us. I mean, Paul was so convinced that the Corinthians were messed up that he called people out by name in the letters that he wrote. I mean, seriously, can you imagine that? That would be like our bishop writing a letter to a congregation, and in the middle of that letter being read to the people, because that's the way the letters were read back in Paul's day. Somebody would stand up and read the letter out loud to everybody. Could you imagine somebody in our day and age reading a letter from the bishop and saying, hey, by the way, Mark and Carl, you all got to shape up. There's a problem here. I couldn't imagine that happening. But that's exactly what Paul did. He called out these people and said, you all got to shape up. And what he does is he tells them to seek the higher gifts, the gifts of love, the gifts of prophecy, the gifts of exhortation and encouragement, in order to build up the community. Get the focus off of yourself and build up and support the community. Well, he uses an analogy to explain their ineffectiveness. He says, you are like an instrument that isn't being played. But you know, I don't think that analogy really works for Paul or for any of us. As a matter of fact, I think the analogy works in a totally different way than I believe Paul intended. Because he says that if you don't play the instrument, it's lifeless, and you get nothing across and nothing happens. But you know, a lifeless instrument is not really lifeless. John Cage, an experimental and avant-garde composer, once went on stage and sat at the bench of a piano, lifted up the lid, and sat there for over an hour. Played nothing. Nothing happened. There was no music. He got up, he bowed, and he left the stage. Hundreds of people were there to hear that. Thousands, if not millions, have seen it on video. That was not an indistinct event with no connection. It was actually an event that connected hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions of people with the simple idea of imagining what the piano could have done. Imagining what John Cage was trying to get across. Wondering what it was all about. It was a community event. It reminds me of a time a few years ago when I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and I went to visit the Musical Instrument Museum. There were thousands of instruments, and they were grouped by country and by genre. My favorite instrument was the guitar case that was sitting on the ground. It was open, there was nothing in it, and it said, "Here's the air guitar." It was worth a laugh. But there were hundreds of people wandering around this museum with these instruments that weren't being played. But all of us, I'm sure, were imagining what it was like. We were imagining how these beautiful things could communicate something wonderful with sound, even though there was no sound from them. We were using our imagination. And I think what Paul is really calling the Corinthians to do is use their imagination. Can you imagine yourself not being so obsessed with your personal salvation? Can you imagine yourself in conversation with and reconciliation with those with whom you have conflict? Can you imagine reaching out to the world and being effective? We have come together for these 3 days for that very purpose. We are here to imagine what the world could be like in the midst of this time of hostility, violence, hatred, trauma. We have to face all this. It is a reality. It is what we deal with now. But we still can look at the world the same way we might look at those instruments, and to imagine and to know what is actually possible in terms of healing, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of hope. To imagine it means we can begin to make it happen. And if we can begin to make it happen, we're seeing beyond our personal obsession with salvation. We're seeing beyond the incredible conflict of our lives now. We're seeing beyond the incredible trauma most of us, if not all of us, are dealing with. And we hope and we long for God's vision and God's dream. And because we have taken time at all to step into this place and to let our imaginations move in that direction, we are becoming a new church, a church of hope.